The wind swept across the plains with a biting insistence, carrying with it the scent of smoke and the distant metallic tang of conflict. The horizon, normally calm and golden under the late afternoon sun, now shimmered with tension. Shadows of warriors flickered between trees and hills, moving with a quiet urgency that spoke of danger approaching. In the midst of this restless landscape stood a young woman, her heart hammering against her ribs as if it sensed the chaos before her eyes could fully comprehend it. She had never been so aware of the raw, unpredictable power of the world around her. Every rustle of grass, every cawing of a distant bird, felt amplified, urgent, like a drumbeat warning of coming storm. From the edge of the camp, a figure emerged. A Cheyenne warrior whose presence seemed to carve a path through the tension like a blade through silk. He moved with purposeful strength, the long lines of his body taut with readiness, every step measured and deliberate. His eyes, dark and unwavering, scanned the surroundings as though he were reading the very soul of the land. There was an authority in the way he held himself that brooked no argument, a natural command born of experience, of knowing both the fragility and ferocity of life. "Get inside," he barked, his voice cutting through the din of the wind and distant calls. The words were not merely instructions. They were a lifeline tossed across the void of danger. The young woman froze at the sound, her body jolting in response to the urgency in his tone. It was as though time itself had slowed, each syllable striking her with a physical weight she had not anticipated. The command was simple, yet it carried the authority of one who had faced countless perils and emerged unbroken. Her first instinct was to obey. She had learned over time to respect the presence of those who moved with certainty through life's chaos. But in that moment, something else, a contradictory, strange pull, tugged at her attention. She felt a curious mixture of fear and something unnameable, a whisper of longing she did not yet understand. Her mind spun, caught in the collision between survival instinct and the magnetic draw of the warrior's unwavering gaze. She shook, as though the movement might shake loose the confusion and clarify her next step. But clarity remained elusive. Around her, the camp was alive with activity, yet the world seemed to narrow to the space between her and him. Smoke from distant fires twisted skyward, mingling with the golden light of the setting sun, creating a surreal glow that made the moment feel suspended outside of ordinary time. She could hear the low murmur of voices from nearby tents, the hurried clatter of preparations as if the entire world was signaling the imminence of something dangerous. Yet none of it touched her as much as his presence did, a force that both intimidated and captivated, warning and inviting at once. Her senses heightened. The scent of leather and earth from his attire mingled with the sharp tang of gunpowder and the dusty plains air, grounding her in the reality of the moment while simultaneously drawing her into a world of heightened emotion. Every muscle in her body seemed attuned to the smallest shift an inch of movement, a tightening of the jaw, the way his hand hovered near the weapon at his side. The command had been simple, but it carried layers she could not yet decipher. Obedience would mean safety, yet something about staying, about observing him closer, seemed equally compelling. She took a cautious step toward the shelter, then halted, caught in a liminal space between the instinct to flee and the pull toward the warrior. His eyes followed her, not with impatience, but with a steady, quiet intensity that made her heart race. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and she brushed it away, acutely aware of every sound, every sensation. The command, "Get inside," resonated in her mind like a drumbeat echoing through a canyon, clear, insistent, unavoidable. It was both a warning and a promise, an anchor in the swirling uncertainty of the moment. As she finally moved toward the doorway, her feet heavy with hesitation, the warrior's figure remained a stark, unyielding presence against the wild, untamed backdrop. She realized then that the command was more than words. It was a declaration of control in a world that often felt uncontrollable. And in that moment, standing at the threshold between safety and exposure, fear and longing collided within her in a way that she would not soon forget. She froze in the doorway, caught between the warmth and safety of the shelter and the unpredictable wilderness that stretched beyond the camp. The warrior's voice still echoed in her mind, reverberating with an authority that refused to be ignored. Get inside. It was a command meant to preserve life, yet it felt layered with something more, a subtle insistence that stirred a strange, unsteady awareness in her chest. Her body trembled. A subtle shake that started in her hands and worked its way through her shoulders and down to her legs. It was not just the cold wind brushing against her skin. It was the raw intensity of the moment pressing against her nerves. Every instinct screamed that she should obey, that she should step fully inside and seal herself away from the storm of smoke, wind, and danger beyond the walls. Yet her mind refused to be so obedient. She felt an unusual pull toward him, toward the warrior who stood there like a living emblem of strength and certainty. His eyes had not softened, but they had not hardened either. They were steady, observing, as if measuring not just the situation but her reaction to it. She could feel his attention brushing against her awareness, an invisible weight that made her heart lurch and settle in an uneven rhythm. Fear battled curiosity, instinct collided with fascination, and her body betrayed her resolve with every hesitant step. A sound, a distant shout, the sharp crack of a weapon made her flinch violently, her hands clenching at her sides. She wanted to cry out, to run fully inside, yet another part of her resisted. Her gaze flicked back to the warrior. He had not moved, had not shouted again, had simply held his ground as the world spun with tension around them. That stillness was disconcerting and magnetic all at once. It was as if the air itself had contracted around him, drawing her attention inescapably toward his presence. Her mind raced through fragments of thoughts, disjointed and urgent. What is danger? What is safety? Every lesson she had ever learned about obedience and caution warred against the instinct that urged her to stay, to understand, to be nearer to the figure who so clearly commanded respect and demanded attention. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow, each inhalation like trying to swallow the storm that raged between her fear and her fascination. The shaking intensified, subtle yet impossible to ignore. She tried to steady herself, to ground her thoughts in reason, reminding herself that the command had been clear, that her safety depended on obedience. Yet even as she stepped further into the shelter, she could feel the echo of the warrior's presence lingering, an invisible tether that refused to let her fully retreat. Her hands lingered on the doorway's frame, fingers brushing against the rough wood, as if seeking reassurance in its solidity while her mind wandered, captivated by the unspoken force of his gaze. It was in that suspended moment, trembling and caught between worlds, that she began to perceive the complexity of her emotions. Fear was tangible, a shadow pressing down on her limbs, sharp and immediate. Longing, however, was subtler, insidious, woven into the way her skin tingled with awareness of him, the way her pulse quickened despite every warning her rational mind hurled at her. The two forces collided, a volatile mix that made it impossible to separate instinct from desire. She realized, with sudden clarity, that the fear she felt was not only for herself, but for the fragile boundary that now existed between them. Every moment she lingered was a negotiation with danger, not just the physical peril outside, but the emotional turbulence that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. And yet, she could not step fully back, could not sever the invisible connection that bound her attention, her curiosity and her trembling heart to him. The wind howled outside, rattling the edges of the shelter and carrying the distant clamor of approaching chaos. Inside, the world had narrowed to a singular point of focus, the warrior, unmoving and commanding, and herself suspended in hesitation. Her body shook again, more violently this time. not simply from cold or fear, but from the raw intensity of standing so close to someone who inspired both awe and longing. Finally, she took a tentative step further inside, her eyes never leaving his. The distance remained charged with unspoken energy, every movement small yet heavy with significance. In that brief, tense moment, she understood that the encounter was no longer just about survival. It was about recognition of authority, of danger, and of a strange, compelling pull that defied logic and reason. The shaking subsided only slightly as she balanced herself between the fear that demanded obedience and the longing that urged her to linger, caught utterly, entirely, between two powerful forces she could not name. Once inside, the shelter offered a thin barrier between her and the chaos beyond, yet it did little to calm the storm within her. The warrior's command had been obeyed, and yet she could not quiet the sensation of being pulled in two directions at once. Fear clung to her like a second skin, sharp and insistent, warning her of the dangers outside. And yet, the proximity of the Cheyenne warrior created a pull she could not deny, a magnetism that stirred a restless, almost dangerous longing deep within her chest. She pressed her back against the rough wooden wall, feeling its cool surface beneath her trembling hands. Every instinct screamed that she should retreat completely into the safety of the shelter, away from the tension radiating from him like heat from a fire. But as her gaze swept across the space, it inevitably returned to him, to the way his presence filled the room without movement, commanding attention through sheer force of being. His eyes were steady, dark, unwavering, observing her with a quiet intensity that made her pulse accelerate despite her desire for calm. Her mind churned. Why does his presence make me feel this way? She wondered, trying to analyze the pull that seemed almost unnatural. Fear had a clarity to it. It was rational, primal, protective. Longing was different. It was an undercurrent that defied logic, threading through her thoughts in flashes of warmth and tension. She felt it in the tightening of her chest, in the sudden awareness of her own breathing, in the way her fingers twitched against the wall as though craving contact with something she could not yet define. She looked at him, studying the lines of his face, the set of his shoulders, the way his hands rested near his weapons, relaxed yet ready. The warrior embodied a certainty she had never known in herself. It frightened her to recognize how deeply she was drawn to it, to someone whose world seemed so much larger and more controlled than her own. Yet the fear of being caught, of misjudging the situation, compounded the intensity of her feelings. Each glance felt like a negotiation, each breath a delicate balancing act between instinctive caution and the pull of something she could not name. The room itself seemed to shrink around her, concentrating every sound and movement. The crackling of a small fire nearby, the rustle of her own clothing, even the warrior's measured breathing became magnified, creating a symphony of sensation she could neither ignore nor fully interpret. Her body shook not just from fear, but from the collision of fear and desire, a physical manifestation of her conflicted emotions. She wanted to retreat, to hide fully from both the physical and emotional danger. Yet another part of her ached to remain, to observe him, to feel the weight of his attention as a tangible thing pressing gently against her awareness. She imagined what it would be like to reach out, to bridge the distance, to make contact, not just physically, but in a way that might communicate the turmoil within her. And with that thought came an almost painful awareness. Such a step could be reckless. It could invite consequences she was not prepared to face. Yet the desire persisted, insistent and impossible to ignore. Fear and longing were intertwined, twisting together in a knot that made her stomach churn and her heart pound. The warrior shifted slightly, a subtle movement that spoke of readiness, of awareness, and yet of patience. He had not advanced toward her, had not issued another command, but the quiet strength of his presence was enough to hold her attention captive. She realized, almost with a sense of both dread and exhilaration, that he was not merely a figure of authority or danger. He had become the axis around which her conflicted emotions rotated. Her fear was sharpened by the knowledge that he could be dangerous, yet her longing was sharpened just as keenly by the recognition of his steadiness. His certainty, his intensity. Time seemed suspended, the world outside the shelter fading into insignificance compared to the internal drama she now faced. Her thoughts circled endlessly between self-preservation and surrender to the magnetic pull of the warrior. She felt exposed, vulnerable, yet strangely alive, every nerve ending alert to both threat and possibility. The fear that had driven her inside now danced with a tantalizing edge of longing, creating a delicate, dangerous tension she could not fully untangle. And in that quiet, charged space, she understood the truth of her situation. She was caught entirely, completely, in a liminal space where instinct and desire collided. Survival demanded retreat, logic demanded distance, but something deeper, more visceral, demanded attention, curiosity, and perhaps even closeness. Fear and longing were no longer separate. They had fused into a single, consuming sensation that left her trembling, breathless, and utterly aware of the man whose mere presence had upended her sense of balance and control. The storm of fear and longing that had taken residence inside her began to shift ever so slightly, not through movement or command, but through something smaller, subtler. She noticed it first in the slight furrow of the warrior's brow, the almost imperceptible tension around his eyes. He had stood so unwaveringly, so immovable, that she had assumed his presence was purely an emblem of authority, an unyielding force of discipline and danger. Yet now, in this brief, fleeting moment, she saw a fracture, a tiny human quiver beneath the surface. It startled her, not because it diminished him, but because it made him profoundly real. He shifted his weight just slightly, emotion almost lost in the dim firelight of the shelter, yet it spoke volumes. His gaze softened not toward her, exactly, but in a way that suggested thoughtfulness, concern, and a humanity she had not expected to witness in someone so commanding. Her pulse quickened as she realized she was watching more than a warrior. She was witnessing a man navigating his own silent battle, a human being whose presence carried not only authority but depth. She blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the sudden awareness. The trembling that had plagued her since she obeyed his command did not cease, but it transformed. Fear was still present, still sharp at the edges, but it was no longer the only force driving her body. Longing, curiosity, and an almost desperate empathy now threaded through her chest, mingling with the terror of the outside world. She wondered what thoughts passed through his mind as he stood there, seemingly calm yet subtly alive with unspoken emotion. The warrior's eyes met hers briefly, and though the contact was fleeting, it struck her with the weight of significance. In that glance, there was a quiet acknowledgment, a recognition of her presence, and perhaps of her inner turbulence. It was not commanding, nor was it intrusive. It was steady, careful, and entirely human. For the first time, she felt a flicker of connection that was not dictated by fear or obedience, but by something softer, something that suggested that beneath his imposing exterior, there was understanding, even empathy. Her own breath caught in her throat. She realized she had been so focused on his authority, on the magnetic pull of his presence, that she had not considered the possibility of vulnerability. And now that she glimpsed it, she felt an almost painful awareness of how delicate and fleeting it was. It was a crack in the armor, a momentary pause in the relentless intensity of his command that allowed her a space to breathe and to feel. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced across his strong features, softening the sharp lines that had seemed so formidable. She noticed the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the controlled rhythm of his breathing, the way his hands rested near the weapons at his side, not in a threatening way, but in readiness. He was human, and it struck her that this humanity made the pull she felt toward him even more potent. Strength and vulnerability coexisted in him, and that duality mesmerized her. She took a tentative step closer, almost imperceptible, her body moving despite the voice in her mind that urged caution. Every instinct told her to maintain distance, yet the faint glimpse of humanity had unlocked a curiosity she could not suppress. She wanted to understand him, to see more than the warrior's exterior, to witness the man beneath the command and intensity. The shaking that had gripped her since entering the shelter intensified slightly, though now it carried a new flavor. It was anticipation, laced with fear, tempered by fascination. In that suspended moment, the world outside the shelter faded further into irrelevance. The wind and distant cries of conflict became background noise, a chorus to the quiet drama unfolding between them. For the first time, she allowed herself to see him not only as a figure of authority, but as a person complex, strong, and yet undeniably human. And in that realization, her heart ached in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The warrior did not speak, yet the silence was not empty. It carried weight, meaning, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the fragile bridge forming between them. Fear, longing, and newfound curiosity wove together in her chest, creating a tension that was both electric and delicate. In that brief glimpse of his humanity, she recognized the possibility of connection, the potential for something more than obedience or survival, and the stirring realization that the story unfolding between them was far from simple. The shelter offered safety, but safety had become complicated. Every instinct screamed for her to retreat fully, to draw the boundary of obedience as sharply as she could. And yet another, more insistent voice urged her forward, a quiet, unrelenting curiosity that had taken root in her chest. She had followed the command, moved inside, and yet she felt no relief. Instead, a new tension gripped her, one that demanded a decision, to remain safely distant or to acknowledge the pull toward him, the magnetic force that seemed to radiate from every measured motion of the warrior. Her gaze flicked toward him, and she realized how acutely aware she had become of his presence. Every detail of him was etched in her mind, the way his shoulders squared with quiet authority, the deliberate rhythm of his breathing, the sharp glint of his eyes as they tracked the movements within the shelter. Each observation carried a weight, a magnetic insistence that made it harder to step away. She felt her pulse quicken, her body responding to him even as her mind cataloged the dangers outside. Fear and curiosity warred for dominance, and her trembling hands betrayed the intensity of the conflict. She considered retreating, stepping fully back into the safety of the shelter's far corner, letting her instincts for survival take precedence. It would be logical, rational, protective. But the moment she imagined that, she also felt a pang of disappointment, a subtle ache she could not ignore. Something about him, about the quiet intensity, the mixture of strength and vulnerability, demanded acknowledgement. To step back entirely would be to deny the truth of her own awareness, the awareness of the connection, however fleeting and fragile, that had begun to form. Her mind raced, questioning her own motives. Why am I drawn to him? She thought, the question both frustrating and impossible to answer. Fear had been simple to understand. It was tangible, primal. Desire, curiosity, fascination, they were nebulous, unpredictable, and potent. And now that she recognized them in herself, the fear seemed only sharper, more urgent, as though punishing her for daring to feel anything beyond instinctive self-preservation. Yet the longing was undeniable, threading through her chest in quiet insistence, impossible to ignore. The warrior's eyes met hers again, and in that gaze she felt the unspoken recognition of her hesitation. He did not command, did not scold, did not make any movement toward her. He simply watched, steady and unflinching. And in that simple act, he communicated more than words could have: patience, awareness, and an implicit invitation to act or not. The power of choice weighed heavily on her, the gravity of possibility pressing against her ribs. To obey fully would mean safety, but to acknowledge the pull of curiosity meant risk, emotional and perhaps physical. She took a tentative step forward, not toward him directly, but enough to shorten the distance in her mind. Each movement was deliberate, measured, as if she were testing not only the space around her, but the limits of her own courage. Her body shook slightly, not entirely from fear, but from the adrenaline of the choice itself, the awareness that she was straddling a line between obedience and exploration, between rational caution and instinctive curiosity. The world outside the wind, the smoke, the distant cries faded into irrelevance. Within the shelter, time slowed, and every glance, every breath, every subtle shift in posture became charged with meaning. She felt alive in a way that terrified her, fully aware that the tension between them was a dangerous spark. And yet, the spark was irresistible, illuminating the contours of her desire to understand him, to see what lay beneath the surface of the warrior's calm authority. Finally, she made a decision not to abandon caution entirely, but not to withdraw either. She would remain cautious yet attentive, allowing herself to witness the humanity she had glimpsed without fully surrendering to it. She would observe, measure, feel, and engage the magnetic pole without ignoring the fear that demanded vigilance. The choice was a compromise, a delicate balance, but it was hers. And in that choice, she felt the first flush of empowerment, a strange exhilaration born from acknowledging both fear and curiosity. Simultaneously, the warrior watched her with quiet patience, and in that silence, a subtle acknowledgment passed between them. Neither had spoken, yet both understood the tension, the fragile possibility, the electric awareness of connection. Her heart thudded with anticipation, her mind alight with the unknown, and for the first time, she allowed herself to inhabit the space fully, embracing the tension, the fear, and the longing all at once. The moment finally demanded movement. She stepped fully into the shelter, closing the distance between herself and the warmth of safety, though the air between her and the warrior remained charged with unspoken energy. Every step felt deliberate, measured, heavy with anticipation, as if the act of entering this confined space magnified the intensity of their unspoken connection. The world outside the wind, the smoke, the distant cries receded into a blur, leaving only the taut, electric air that pressed against her skin. Her hands brushed against the rough wooden walls, grounding her as her pulse hammered in response to both fear and longing. She could feel his presence like a tangible force, a gravity that drew her awareness inward, focused entirely on him. The shelter, small and dimly lit by a flickering fire, seemed to shrink around them, transforming the space into a cocoon where survival and desire collided. Every subtle movement, the way he shifted his weight, the tilt of his head, the quiet exhale that escaped his lungs was amplified, magnified by the confined surroundings. The closeness was dizzying. She could sense the heat radiating from him, the subtle rhythm of his breathing, the barely perceptible shift of his body as he maintained readiness while remaining still. It was a paradoxical intimacy. She was aware of every detail, yet he remained untouchable, commanding, a figure whose strength was both reassuring and intimidating. Her chest tightened, not only from the physical proximity, but from the torrent of conflicting emotions that now swirled unchecked. Fear whispered that the danger outside was not gone, that she must remain vigilant, while longing stirred a quiet, persistent ache that made her hands tremble. Her gaze met his briefly, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. There were no words, no explanations, yet the intensity of the connection was undeniable. It was as if the act of entering the shelter had drawn them into a shared orbit, a space where survival instincts and emotional currents were inextricably intertwined. Every heartbeat felt magnified, echoing against the wooden walls, a reminder of the precarious balance between caution and desire. The firelight flickered, casting shifting shadows that danced across his strong features. She noticed the subtle softening of his expression, the tiniest crease of concern at the corner of his eyes. In that instant, she felt a wave of empathy mixed with longing, a recognition of the humanity she had glimpsed before. He was not merely a warrior. He was a person navigating the same tension between danger and awareness that she now felt coursing through her veins. The knowledge made her pulse quicken, and the trembling that had plagued her since the first command returned. Only now it was layered with anticipation. She took a hesitant step closer, small and deliberate, as if testing the boundaries of both space and propriety. The air between them seemed to thrum with energy, charged by proximity, by the unspoken tension of being caught together in a confined space. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized that every glance, every minor shift of position, carried weight, meaning, and potential consequence. The shelter was no longer just a place of refuge, it had become a stage for an emotional dance, one that balanced delicately on the edge of fear, curiosity, and attraction. The warrior remained still, his eyes steady and observant, giving her the space to move while maintaining the subtle tension of authority. He did not command, nor did he intrude. Yet his presence was overwhelming, undeniable. She felt the magnetic pull of his attention, the quiet insistence that she acknowledged not only the danger outside, but the complex, tantalizing energy between them. Every inch she moved was a negotiation, a careful navigation of boundaries, a silent acknowledgement of the tension building in the small room. As she finally settled into the shelter, her back pressed lightly against the wall, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, though her heart continued to race. She was physically safe, yet the emotional intensity of being this close to him made her acutely aware of every sensation, his proximity, the warmth of the space, the electricity of unspoken understanding. Fear and longing intertwined, creating a heady, almost dizzying awareness that left her simultaneously trembling and aware of a strange, exhilarating clarity. In that charged, intimate space, survival and desire became inseparable. The shelter was more than refuge. It was a crucible in which her emotions and instincts collided. Fear urged caution, yet longing pulled her closer. Obedience had brought her inside, but curiosity and attraction made it impossible to retreat fully. And in the quiet, electric pause that followed, she realized that the true danger was no longer just outside, it existed in the tension, in the awareness, and in the unspoken possibilities between them. The shelter had quieted, but the stillness was anything but peaceful. Outside, the wind rattled against the wooden walls, carrying distant echoes of a world still in turmoil, yet inside the storm had shifted. It no longer raged in the open plains, but had folded inward, nesting itself in the charged air between her and the warrior. Every small sound, the crackle of embers, the faint scrape of her clothing, the measured inhale and exhale of his breath felt amplified, drawing her full attention and leaving her hyper-aware of the shared space they now inhabited. She pressed her back against the wall, feeling the rough wood under her palms, grounding herself as the tremors of adrenaline coursed through her body. Fear and longing had not dissipated. They had merged into a delicate tension, a fragile line she walked between caution and desire. Every glance toward him sparked an awareness that was at once intoxicating and terrifying. The warrior remained still, the quiet authority in his posture heightened by the silence, his presence a constant gravitational pull she could not resist. Her mind wandered, circling the events that had brought her here to this intimate, precarious space. The command to get inside had seemed simple at first, but its implications had grown more complex with every heartbeat. Obedience had led her here, yet compliance was only the beginning. Each passing second intensified the subtle electric energy that had woven itself into the room, threading through the shared glances and the proximity of their bodies. She felt both exposed and seen, the walls of the shelter holding her physically safe while leaving her emotionally vulnerable. She noticed small details, the kind that might have gone unnoticed in a less tense moment. The way his hands rested lightly near his weapon, not in aggression but in readiness. The way his shoulders relaxed slightly as he observed her. The subtle rhythm of his breathing, steady yet deliberate. Each gesture, each micro-movement, carried meaning she could not fully decipher, yet could not ignore. In that quiet observation, a new dimension of her awareness awakened, the realization that she was not simply reacting to danger, but to a presence that held both command and humanity in equal measure. The tension was electric. Every unspoken thought, every suppressed sigh, became a thread in a taut web connecting them. She could feel it in the small spaces between breaths, the subtle shifts of their bodies, the way their attention seemed magnetically drawn to each other despite the absence of words. The room itself seemed to contract, the walls closing in just enough to heighten the intimacy, to make every heartbeat feel like a drum in a silent room. She allowed herself to linger in the gaze of the warrior, tracing the lines of his face, the sharp angles softened by the dim glow of the firelight. There was something profoundly human in the way he observed the space, in the quiet patience with which he maintained his presence. He did not need to speak to communicate 1,000 things: readiness, authority, subtle concern, and an acknowledgement of the fragile tension that had grown between them. Each flicker of his expression resonated within her, amplifying both fear and longing in ways she could not control. Her body, still trembling slightly, responded to the heightened awareness, every nerve ending alert to the smallest movement. Fear reminded her of the dangers beyond the walls, yet longing whispered of the unseen possibilities that lay within this charged silence. Each glance, each subtle shift in posture, was an unspoken conversation that carried weight beyond words. The quiet, once empty, now felt heavy with potential, a tension that was both dangerous and electrifying. For a brief moment, she let herself exhale, allowing the mingling of fear and desire to settle into a strange equilibrium. The warrior remained an immovable presence, yet there was a softness, a recognition of their shared space that made her feel seen without judgment, acknowledged without intrusion. In that stillness, she understood the precarious beauty of the moment. Survival and emotional connection existed side by side, and each choice carried consequences that were as emotional as they were physical. Time seemed suspended. The shelter had become a crucible containing more than just two bodies. It held their awareness, their tension, and the fragile threads of connection that now bound them. Outside, the world continued in chaos, but within these walls, the quiet aftermath of action had transformed into something intimate and electric. Every glance, every heartbeat, every inhalation of breath heightened the suspended awareness between them, leaving her acutely conscious that the danger outside paled in comparison to the emotional storm that now existed between her and the warrior. The wind outside had not quieted, and neither had the distant echoes of the world beyond the shelter. Yet inside, a different kind of storm lingered, one quieter, subtler, but no less intense. She sat against the rough wood, her hands pressed lightly to her knees, feeling the lingering tremors of adrenaline and the pull of something far more complicated. The magnetic presence of the warrior who had commanded her safety, and yet, in that command, had drawn her into a web of unspoken tension. The firelight danced across his features, painting shadows that emphasized both his strength and the faint traces of humanity she had glimpsed earlier. His posture remained steady, controlled, yet she sensed in every small shift a subtle awareness of her presence, a recognition of the delicate balance between fear, respect, and something else, something unnameable, yet undeniable. The silence between them carried weight, heavy with the possibilities they had not yet explored, the words they had not yet spoken, and the choices that awaited them. Her chest rose and fell with careful breaths, each inhalation a reminder of the duality she now inhabited. Survival demanded vigilance. The chaos beyond the shelter's walls was very real. Yet the emotional storm within was equally insistent, pressing her to acknowledge the pull she felt toward him. Fear and longing had fused into a singular, electrifying tension that made each moment feel suspended, as if time itself were holding its breath. She had obeyed, she had taken shelter, and yet the sense of incompleteness lingered, a quiet insistence that the story had not ended. She found herself studying him once again, tracing the lines of his face in the dim light, observing the way his hands rested near his side, not threateningly, but with the readiness that defined him. He was constant, steady, and impossibly present. The awareness of him, the realization that he was not only a warrior, but a man navigating his own unspoken complexities, made her heart pound in ways she could not fully articulate. She was drawn to him, yet conscious of the delicate, dangerous tension that hung between them. The thought struck her sharply. The true danger was not merely outside the shelter. It existed here, in the suspended space between them, in the intensity of their awareness, in the unspoken possibilities that stretched ahead. Every glance carried meaning, every breath seemed amplified, and every heartbeat pulsed with anticipation. She felt alive in a way that frightened her as much as it exhilarated her, aware that each choice moving forward would be significant emotionally, psychologically, perhaps even physically. She glanced once more at the warrior, and for a fleeting second she imagined the world beyond this shelter. The plains, the fires, the chaos of life in motion. In her mind, the two worlds collided, the harshness of survival against the vulnerability of human connection. The command that had brought her here, so simple, so urgent, now seemed layered with complexity she could scarcely parse. What comes next? The question echoed silently within her, unanswered, yet impossible to ignore. The warrior shifted slightly, a micro-movement that spoke volumes, though it was subtle enough to be missed by anyone less attentive. There was patience in his stance, an acknowledgment of her presence, and perhaps a tacit understanding of the tension that neither of them could fully name. He remained an enigma, strong, controlled, and yet undeniably human. That duality, the combination of authority and vulnerability, left her both on edge and irresistibly drawn toward him. In that charged quiet, she realized that the story between them was far from concluded. The shelter had been a crucible, but it had not resolved anything. Fear and longing, duty and curiosity, survival and desire, they all remained in delicate balance, threading through the air like invisible currents. Each moment, each breath, hinted at the possibilities that lay ahead, the choices that would demand courage, and the consequences that could not yet be predicted. She exhaled slowly, feeling the lingering tension in her muscles, the echo of the warrior's presence, and the undeniable awareness that something significant had shifted. The world outside might rage on, unpredictable and violent, but the storm inside, the one born of connection, curiosity, and unspoken intensity, was equally compelling. It promised that nothing here would remain simple, that every next step would carry weight, and that fear and longing would continue to collide in ways neither of them could yet control. And as the fire flickered and the shadows danced, she knew with quiet certainty that the story was only beginning. Survival was temporary. Connection was perilous. And the space between fear and longing, the space they now inhabited, was a threshold neither could ignore. Whatever came next, it would demand awareness, courage, and perhaps a willingness to surrender to the tension that had become their shared reality.